Hey, hello, welcome everybody to this new ShadowDragon podcast. It's season 3, episode 11 already. And today we have a special guest, which I will introduce in just a moment. But we also have a very interesting topic, which I also introduce in just a moment. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Nico Dekens. If you want to look me up, you can better look for Dutch OSINT Guy. That's my username. And I brought my friend as well today again. Dave, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm David Cook, Director of National Security here at ShadowDragon.
And now, last but not least, Jackie, can you please introduce yourself real brief?
Sure. I'm Jackie Giunta. Thanks for having me today. This is an exciting opportunity. And just a little bit of background about myself. So I came out of military intelligence for the U.S. Army and worked with justice in the intelligence sector as well. And then I came over to the private sector where I'm now operating in a corporate intelligence function and really looking at global risk for a global biotech firm. And that's what brings us here today for this exciting conversation.
Yeah, very interesting topic. So, for the audience that doesn't know that much about the industry that you are in, I think it's good for me to give the audience a little bit of background on, first of all, what we do and how that ties into what you do and why we think that this is so important for the world to know a little bit more about it. So, at Shadow Dragon, we focus at a source or target centric approach, which means that we are focusing on the people, the actual persons behind certain technology, which plays more and more, of course, a critical role in due diligence, especially in biotechnology. And since this sector is really expanding, well, I think we all remember COVID and all the other stuff. So all eyes are on companies like that because you do very interesting things. For example, people can use that information or misuse that information. That's maybe a better way to say it, to create, for example, bioweapons or even worse things. So biotechnology companies in general, like laboratories or universities, must be very vigilant when it comes to who has access to your equipment or your intellectual property in general. I think one notable example is that a GenScript company, a biotechnology company, had direct ties with the Chinese CCCP, and there were some concerns that arose about the transfer of sensitive genetic data, for example, which could be exploited or even being used as maybe bioweapons. So that's a very short introduction into this world in general. So, Jackie, can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on why you think doing due diligence in the world that you are in and maybe practicing open source intelligence to get the most out of it could supercharge your findings from an investigative perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So open source or open OSINT has been something that I think the private sector has really refined in a lot of ways because we're seeing this convergence with national security in the private sector. We have adversaries who are exploiting our open markets. They're exploiting the information that we share openly amongst one another to celebrate our innovations, but are doing so in a way to further themselves for maybe their economic strategies, but also military strategies. And there's adversaries like China and the CCP in particular, who there's a direct intersection between those 2 points that becomes difficult to distinguish. So biotech's an exploding market. It's an interesting one to examine. I think there's been a lot of focus on big tech and chips, and we've seen what the Department of Commerce has done there. I think biotech is the next shift. So where we shift the focus and start to examine how our adversaries are interested in exploiting not only the technology, but the innovation and the economic power behind biotech.
So, this is not really my world. I have to be that honest. I don't have that much experience in investigating biotechnology. I remember I told you before we went on this podcast, I had one case where when I was still in government, we were asked to investigate someone that was selling a potential bioweapon on the dark web, and that's my personal experience. Now, how would, for example, a foreign nation state approach this? How would they potentially find, let's say, that person within your company that could glean them interesting information? Do you have some insight in how this is already happening that people should be aware of?
So I think the insider threat perspective it's a huge aspect for any emerging technology, right? So we have people in biotech who spend their life researching something. They have PhDs, they're well educated, they're excited to talk about something that they've spent a lot of time researching. And so to be maybe caught off guard in that sense and manipulated to discussing things or discussing research, that's one avenue, is that insider threat perspective. But then there's also cyber threats. I mean, a lot of these are going to be strategies that are utilized to pursue intellectual property, to pursue sensitive data. And then another aspect as well, going back to China, is that that military civil fusion of where there's ongoing research, maybe partnerships happening with CCP or with just organizations that are in China, or maybe not in China, but there's direct ties back to CCP that may be of concern. And there's a huge lack of transparency there. And that might be just by nature of how China operates. I mean, they're a communist nation. Things are sealed off in a way. And from where we sit in the US, like that lack of transparency is concerning, right? So we know them to be a near peer adversary, and understanding that there could be manipulation from what they're doing with the technology, what they're doing with information, specifically like genetic information, like we mentioned GenScript. That's a lot of what is being talked about now inside the Beltway, because this is really highly sensitive information, and somebody getting your genetic data is not like somebody getting into your bank account. Like, this is a very different threat. So it's something that needs to be front of mind in DC, and I think it's happening now, and hopefully it's not too reactive. And with partnership in the private sector, we can help to ensure that we're becoming more proactive in deterring these threats.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think
sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
there's certainly a light on this, and we're seeing it in most sectors. I mean, venture capital in the defense industrial base and dual use technology, agriculture and real estate. And I would say DC or policymakers, I will say, not DC, but policymakers are getting smarter on this, and the Biosecure Act, I think, is making its way through Congress, which actually names 5 Chinese companies, by name. And so for a lot of biotech companies, and frankly, medical supply chains, are going to have to unwind from China and some of the, I think there'll probably be some other countries that are named as countries of concern. But that's going to take a lot of time and effort. And how do you see that going, Jackie? Like, how, because it's, there's going to have to be a grace period. There's going to be a lot of due diligence that happens between now and then, not just on people, but on supply chains and origin, medical equipment origins.
Right. So I think the grace period's huge. However, time is of the essence for private sector companies to make the pivot, because it's not just about the race to get your data away, whether these private sector companies believe this is an issue or not. I mean, if Biosecure is passed, it looks like it's heading in that direction next year. Then there's going to be a pivot to who's next, who's your manufacturer that is your solution. So looking just in APAC, I mean, there's manufacturers who are of larger scale, but maybe not of the manufacturing supremacy that we see in China. So it's going to be more costly, very likely. There's likely to be some growing pains in terms of manufacturing to keep up with supplies, to keep up with manufacturing models, regulatory concerns. So there's certainly nations and manufacturers in Korea who are poised, maybe in India who are poised, and I think potential for the Philippines or Vietnam, some other regional partners who are friendly in the area that may want to jump in on this in different areas. But there's going to be a race to securing those contracts, because they'll hit capacity quick. That's just my personal assessment, is that they have the potential to hit capacity quick. So bigger biotech firms are going to have to make those moves first. And then some of the smaller guys in the middle are going to be, more vulnerable to having to choose maybe secondary options. Again, due diligence is going to be huge. Even after that pivot, who are you working with now? Are they going to be next on the list? Like, this list isn't just specific to China. it's going to include any adversarial state or actor. So that's one thing I see in that direction for how this is going to shift the future, and how being proactive now is so important to identify not just who's named, who's next, to private sector to get ready.
Yeah. So what you just said really triggered me, because you're mostly talking about, let's say, Asia-orientated countries or businesses. So for me, looking at my experiences, open source intelligence and disclosing information, particularly, for example, from China, is super challenging, which means that performing due diligence on companies in and around China, or the countries that you also named, have some issues that come along with it. You have a language barrier, but you also have, for example, Chinese firewalls and all those other things that you need to at least get access to get the most out of it. Would you then also say that on the proactive side, when you referred earlier to those academics writing research papers or PhDs, and on average, or at least when I look at it, when I wrote my PhD, I'm super proud of it, so I'm excited. So I want the world to know what kind of great work I did. And with that, you could potentially then, of course, overexpose certain sensitive pieces of information that are part of your PhD. Now, my question would be to you, do you now think, with the knowledge that we now have, should we keep publishing those papers publicly, or should we figure out a way to keep this a little bit more to ourselves?
It's a tricky question, because I think in the US, there is this great sense of innovation. People come from all over the world to come here to publish, or even just the West in general, right? Like, people come here because their ideas are fostered. That's really like underscores what the American dream is, right? So certainly maybe in areas that are a bit more sensitive, but I think the direct partnerships in terms of doing advanced research maybe is something that's more scrutinized. And we saw that recently with the Select Committee on the CCP and what they've uncovered with some of these universities who have partnerships that are being exploited. Highly likely that the red flags may have been there, and maybe they just didn't know what to look for, or maybe it was purely, ignorance to what the threats are. But that's worth the discussion in terms of saying my research is something that's so forward leaning. Dual use capability is something we have to think about, right? And it's not new. I mean, this is something that with nuclear threats we've looked at for a long time. So dual use capability it's not really something new, but it's something that is worth maybe re-examining what the approaches were then. It's just that heightened connectivity with the internet, and something's available. You don't have to maybe head to the library and check it out like you used to. So it's certainly something worth examining. Probably not going to have a quick answer for it in the near term.
Yeah, I know that, because in my country, in the Netherlands, there's a huge debate, as well as on those very specialized universities, that they now have a big conversation in the politics. Should we vet who we let into our universities a little bit more? Just making sure that we don't, let's say, make people smarter than they already are. But it also comes with that balance. Are we now being quote unquote racist? Because we don't want to let certain people in, and we still want to give people the freedom to basically absorb all the knowledge that we have over here, or all the possibilities that we have over here, just like you have with the freedom in the US. Yeah, so great balance when it comes to that. Another thing that I wanted to ask you about, when you look at what you do and supply chain in general, how big do you think the risk is, or how fast should we act when it comes to it being easy for others to gain access or insight into the supply chain with making use of open source intelligence or other means?
So I think this is something that companies can do relatively easily. So even at the biotech firm that I'm at here, we were able to utilize general marketing tools just to give us a baseline of just some quick Boolean searches to start looking at and assessing risk, right? So like what's being discussed, what's actively out there that we can dial into. And then from there, those can be jump off points to dig in deeper for due diligence. That's a great way to pick out red flags, right? But also just being aware of who is in your supply chain, I think is a big factor. Get the thresholds of who you're most reliant on, who are your critical suppliers, and then start digging into the research there. But leveraging experts as well, and a lot of times that comes with, licenses that who have access to some of these archive data behind these giant firewalls that, like we discussed earlier with APAC, it can be difficult. It can be difficult to ensure that you're getting the data you need. It's not like doing due diligence on an American-based firm, but just understanding like what the red flags are is a really important start for companies to start getting the right training, getting the right people in the right seats to taking a look at this before it becomes overly problematic and IP starts going out the back door.
When you said monitoring or searching based upon keywords with marketing tools, for example, would you consider that to be more social listening into social media accounts, or would that be specific web pages or forums or something like that?
More so a focus on, you could do it either way, but more so a focus on traditional media sources and news sources, because it's been vetted, there's a little more credibility. That can also be reactionary to some extent, because if it's being reported on, the issue has been acknowledged and it's already being dug into. Whereas maybe some social listening can be a better cues for dialing into individuals, as opposed, like you mentioned earlier, where it's not so much the entity, but it could be an individual within an entity that's of more so of concern, and just seeing where those connective nodes take you to identifying a larger network.
So would that also have to do with, for example, when we had the pandemic, where people all of a sudden were very skeptical about the products that are made by these biotechnology companies? So is the threat only coming from, let's say, those CCP orientated government bodies, or is it also people that simply distrust what biotech in general does, and with that they want to maybe expose certain things that they think are important for their agenda, which could lead to making other people, again from foreign countries, more wise than they already are? That's something that you see or think we should also pay attention to?
Yeah, I think so. The interesting thing about this is I think there is a direct tie between this in a lot of ways. And it's from that due diligence of running down, like, who are these false information actors, and kind of building out a network there to say, wow, there's a lot more connectivity here than we thought, whether it's in terms of the dialogue, whether it's in terms of who associates with who, really kind of following these networks and following the money. It's you could trace a lot of these back to nation state initiatives, or more, I think they're more intentional initiatives from specific networks. So it's interesting. And I think it's something that it garnered a lot of attention during COVID. There was a lot of people who had input, and rightfully so. And that's something that we foster in the free world. People, freedom of speech. Yeah. But it's manipulated in a lot of ways by adversarial states who exploit that ability, and they know what those triggers are. So they lean into it because it's gaining traction. They know how to manipulate an algorithm. And that's something that I think deserves more education and information for our younger populations, our older populations, really anybody using social media, to start to step back and say, what am I sharing? Where did this come from? Like, it's more than just a headline or a catchy post. Like, there's something deeper here that's driving people to have these opinions.
Yeah, I remember vividly during that time that people started sharing, let's say, little blobs from research papers without citing the source. For example, just nitpicking those pieces of information that fit their agenda and their narrative, trying to, again, influence the reader in changing their mind or changing other people their mind. So yeah, I like that you at least acknowledge that that is still happening, and it didn't stop at that moment in time. It's still happening a lot. Dave, I think looking at what we discussed earlier, maybe we also want to talk a little bit more about how the U.S. House of Representatives is talking about this in general, and how they talk about the Biosecure Act that just passed. Something that you want to chip in about that?
Yeah. Like I said before, I think policymakers are really wising up to supply chains. COVID had a big big play in that as well. Sometimes I remember I had a go bag that I brought out recently, and had some old Army medical issued medical stuff like nasal pharyngeal and some combat gauze and stuff. I started looking at it; it's all made in China. So I think that's a huge vulnerability. It's not just the biotech itself, but actual medical equipment. If the balloon goes up and we have to shift those supply chains quickly. But yeah, that's Congress is looking at that, and I think they're looking at all of it, every aspect of it. And the Biosecure Act was one of the a big display of that. And just some nuance here, as because this is rare bipartisanship in Congress, is that the Biosecure Act passed the House on suspension of the rules, which means that they'll bypass the rules for both sides, both parties to debate. It passed 306 to 81. Not many things are bipartisan these days. And there's a Senate companion. So, Jack, you said, it's probably going to pass next year after this, whatever happens in November. But I don't think this is the end of it. And in fact, the bill gives, let me find this, the director of the Office of Management 365 days to name other countries of concern. And so, Jackie, you were talking about networks. Who's the biggest perpetrator here? Like, who's the biggest? We
Yeah,
talk
so
a lot about China, but
we talk a lot about China, but the State Department cites Russia and North Korea have biological weapons programs, and Russia's goes back. I mean, we have direct information on how robust their programs were. So we talk a lot about China, and you're right in the supply sense, right? Like we have to decouple just for a national security perspective. And I think private sector, that's disruptive. They say it'll fall back on the customer in terms of a price point, any price increases, but really, like, from a national security standpoint, we can't be overly reliant on the manufacturing hubs and the supply chains running through and being controlled by China. And we know through their initiative, we know through Made in China 2025 that, like, biotech is among their named initiatives. So important to disrupt that. But going back to additional actors, I mean, Russia, they don't have as much control over supply chain. Maybe that's what drives it, but there's other areas that I think Russia and its partners, we have to examine closely. Like, we got to look at Iran and what they've been doing. We know that there's been exfiltration of that justice has indicted for people, sending out, whether it was IP or actual material to Iran. So those are just some of the big ones. But I think an important thing when it comes to biological weapons is non-state actors, and that's kind of the tricky thing when it comes to biodefense, right? Is attribution, and how do you tie, if there were to be a biological threat deployed against any population, and we're seeing now that, yeah, it's feasible to say that you could do a targeted attack. How do you attribute it? And do we have the technology to say, from bioforensics or biosurveillance standpoint, to say that we can truly attribute this to any actor, really? Like, whether it's the guy in the garage down the road, or if it's, a massive lab operation in China. And I don't know, I think that's something, that's a gap that the government needs to lean into to identify that. But then that's a great starting point in terms of what does our threat profile look like for this stuff? And it's multifaceted. It's biodefenses, it's economic strategy, but it's also, the true risk of the militarized use of weaponized technology.
yeah, so researching this topic found that there's some red teams and an exercise done that some experts, right, doctors and medical professionals were using LLMs or generative AI to come up with bioweapons, and the results were very scary. And my take on this, and this, and Nico knows this, is when you diffuse that type of technology to non-state actors, to anybody with $20 a month and an internet connection, that can be very dangerous. And you're talking about attribution, and that's going to be really hard. I think, that's another application for open source intelligence, because people want to, they want to take credit for what's out there. And I think that you're going back to what Nico was talking about, the gray literature that's out there on medical information. I mean, you could take 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 pages of that, run it through generative AI, and now all of a sudden you're an expert.
Yes, that's definitely the scary aspect, is like, who is this feasible? Like, what's your threat profile, right? Like, or what's the landscape look like? And it's across the spectrum, and that's enabled by AI, right? So I think we're waking up to this realization, and we're seeing that we got to start to maybe control precursors like nucleic acids, and it's resembles a lot of what was done with nuclear proliferation. So it's I think there's something there that rhymes, right? Like, that we have to start to look at in terms of models.
That's
So
scary.
let's say government, what I like to call tunnel vision, that only focuses on nation states or APT, is something that we need to let go. We need to focus on, it could potentially be anyone, that some people just want to watch the world burn just because they can. And now they have that capability with the form of AI.
Definitely. Those are your scariest actors too, because I think that was a major deterrent prior to the ability or the feasibility to have targeted weapons, is like that concept of overspray, right? Like, going back to like my law enforcement background, it's like, oh, when you have to use OC spray, like everyone's going to get sprayed. Like, you don't want to use it, right? Like, it's not really effective, but it's effective, but at what cost, right? But when you think about non-state actors or just like a lone actor, that doesn't matter, right? So maybe they don't know how to bioengineer something that is going to exclude them from harm, but maybe they don't care, right? So that's the scary factor of it.
And also, I think we should never underestimate that we may think that, for example, a CCP-backed threat actor is doing certain things to you or your company, but it could also be Russians pretending to be Chinese and vice
Right.
versa. So that attribution is so hard to detect, but it's definitely something where we need OSINT and maybe digital forensics, as well as people that do red teaming. It's a combination of, I think, where we need to educate each other, but also help out each other a little bit more. So government and industry need to really team up a little bit more to, well, protect ourselves from all kinds of horrors that the world may have to offer in the near future.
Yeah,
How's,
definitely. I
how's,
think it's oh, go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, how scared should we be, Jackie?
I know, isn't it like the more you research it, the more it's like, oh God, this is paralyzing. And I think in a lot of ways, that's why people haven't addressed it, maybe in some regard. It's like, the more you think about it, it's like, wow, this is pretty crazy concept, right? Like, to think about the potential for genetically engineered targeted attacks against specific populations. So I'm not sure in terms of what is being discussed inside the government right now, but I know it's a hot topic in the IC. I know it's something that is garnering a lot of attention. So if that speaks to anything, maybe it is something that's a pressing for a good reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think in general, I think it's also the responsibility of the employees working in biotech companies in general. Because I recently had an experience where someone phoned me and they said, hey, on my LinkedIn, someone that I've been connected to, from which I thought that was a legit person, now started sending me links. Luckily, that individual was trained to have that awareness and not automatically click a link. But in this case, he said that link was so well crafted that it made it look like that he wanted me to read a certain research paper that was really into what he was really into. So he was like, ooh, exciting, I want to read it. But then he was like, oh, whoa, 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 maybe not. Maybe don't click this URL immediately because I might expose my machine to malware or something, and now they have control over my host machine, or simply learning that you are that weak spot in the chain that you are willing to do something on behalf of a request. Is that something that you see increase in the recent years?
Yeah, I think the social engineering is gotten very clever. I think that's been enhanced by AI in a lot of ways, but the education piece is huge. I mean, really educating employees on what these threats look like, and I think in a lot of ways, your typical body of employees are going to be shocked that like they would be targeted, right? Or like they would be the way into some of these huge biotech firms that have great technology and innovation. So it's like, oh, it won't happen to me, right? But and then until it does. So just being aware of that, piggyback on the cyber education that's already happening, and that's a great way. It's not, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but it's a great way to say like this is how these threats often manifest, and here's some instances where they can materialize in other ways. So creating connectivity between some of these corporate security groups in biotech, learn from tech what they've already experienced and continue to experience, and then collaborate with public sector and the government so that everyone can stay informed and try their best to stay ahead of the variety of attack vectors that can manifest in this industry.
But I think that then also implies that how easy can you be found as a potential target, right?
Right.
That's hard because especially academics and researchers very often rely on their community, so they need to put themselves out there because they want to have that connection to others. But for me, it's fairly easy because this is what I do for a living to craft a persona, a virtual identity that looks awfully real. And if, again, you don't do your due diligence on who's trying to connect to you on Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever platform you're active at, you could, again, expose yourself by showing in your bio description that you studied somewhere or that you work somewhere. That by itself could make you very, very vulnerable. Would that then for you imply that certain employees within a company should be to some extent prohibited to share that information on their working or private social media accounts when they work at sensitive parts within a company?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a consideration, but is it also, a deterrent in some regard for people who, like you said, like to stay relevant, you got to stay published, right? You got to stay marketable. So that's a tricky balance. But it also comes down to being able to do the due diligence on people who sit in those key roles to help protect them as well, right? So you're looking at, I mean, I've seen instances in which Russian disinformation platforms have stolen the identity of somebody who is a legitimate academic or researcher, and then published something totally false, disinformation, targeted different sectors of the world, but looked as if it was published by somebody who is well established in this research. So having the ability to leverage a corporate security or corporate intelligence function to stay ahead of that is super important for not just the company, but the brand and the business and the research and technology that you're doing in national security.
But it also means that almost every biotech company should set up investigative teams, right? Because looking
Absolutely.
at the landscape, this is nearly impossible to do manually, first of all, but also not on your own. So you need a battalion of people at least to protect your company and do the actual collection of data, as well as processing and exploiting and analyzing to make sense of, hey, where is the risk? Who's the risk? What is the risk, right?
That's exactly right. So looking at, I think companies, it's so important to be honest and look at your threat landscape. And is it all about, somebody coming over the fence for the company, or is it about someone coming through a LinkedIn message or somebody coming through the back door of a supply of a digital supplier? That's the reality of the threat landscape in a lot of ways. And that's why it's so important, as you said, to create these teams who are, trained people or get them the proper training, and then leverage the appropriate vendors to get them access to these types of platforms that can help in a timely way get them the information they need to make more well-informed decisions on security for the business.
So it's all about scalability in all reality, right?
Exactly. Right, right.
Well, Dave, do you have some closing questions or closing remarks?
Famous last question. What are you reading, Jackie?
Oh, right now I'm reading Freedom's Forge, which is amazing, right? Like, but that's no nexus to to the biotech sector right now. But the huge question is like, how do we get public and private to collaborate? And I think that's why I picked up the book, and that's why I'm examining it. But I mean, so that's really like the thing to leave off with, right? Is like, let's stay connected, but also stay diligent or stay vigilant with who you're connecting with. And yeah, we got to figure out a way forward where the public and private can understand like legislation's happening. It's happening for a reason. We have to embrace this change, and we have to move forward together, all in the interest of national security.
Yeah. We're on the same wavelength. I'm reading Call to Arms.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So
I'll pick
freedom
that one up
towards
next.
Yeah, that one's next. We'll swap. Yeah.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, and we'll be in touch. And this is awesome, Jackie. Come back on anytime.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. This was this podcast again, ShadowDragon podcast Season 3, episode 11. I need to think about it every time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, feel free to hit us up on the social media platforms. We're almost everywhere active, so just simply look for shadowdragon.io. Thanks, everybody, and up till the next one.